So good afternoon, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you very much for your hospitality and for your invitation. It's a great, great honor for me to give this lecture in this prestigious place and almost under the eyes of Mendel. It's even more impressive. So thank you for being here. So I'm going to talk about unethical behavior from experimental economics perspective. But I'm sure that if there are psychologists or sociologists in the room, they will find some topics very familiar. I would start with some examples to show you if you need to be convinced that unethical behavior is pretty pervasive. If you think of corruption, if you think of corruption in sports, fraud in education, fraud in public transport, and this field is extremely interesting. It's credence good markets in which consumers may be overcharged, may receive under provision of goods or over provision of goods without knowing that. And so there are many, many examples that you can imagine of unethical behavior. Just to be more precise on some examples, we talk a lot about tax evasion, for example, and the estimates of the importance of the tax gap show that for the US, for example, it's about 16% of the taxes that are not paid. So it represents a huge amount of money. Of course, it's not tax evasion by salaried people, because you see here wages and salaried are perfectly reported. But the problem comes more from capital gains, property income, rents and royalties. And of course, it's easier to hide these incomes to tax authorities. You could also think of tax avoidance, and this is also a serious issue because it also represents a huge amount of money. Another example, corruption. It's difficult to measure corruption by definition, but the estimates are that bribes represent about 5% of the global GDP, which is again amazing. So usually we use this data from Transparency International, and they collect data about the perception of people about the corruptibility of public servants in their country. And they do that for 140 countries in the world. And you see they compute a score. The closer to 100 you are, the better the situation is. And they rank countries. So I just check for Czech Republic, if you want to know precisely. So the first ranked in terms of the less corrupt would be New Zealand, and the last one in this ranking would be Somalia. They conducted a survey in 2017, and this survey showed that 25% of people report that they had to pay a bribe to get access to a public service in the past 12 months. Which is, if you consider that it's for the whole world, on average, it's also a pretty serious issue. Another example is fraud in the financial sector. Of course, if you have a little bit of savings, you would like to put these savings on saving accounts, but now the saving accounts don't give a high return. And since it's returned very, very little interest rates, you may be tempted to invest in more risky assets. But the problem is that usually we don't have expertise. So we need to rely on the recommendation of financial advisors. And these financial advisors, they have private information that they can exploit or not, at your advantage or at their own advantage. And of course, we can see a lot of examples of scandals in the financial market. You are all familiar with this Madoff scandal, perhaps with the Wells Fargo scandal. So the Wells Fargo, it's a bank that created fake accounts to clients. So you could have several accounts, but you were not even aware of that. But you paid for this, but so it created a fake activity for the bank. So this is a serious issue, but detectable. These scandals have been detected. But more serious may be the earnings reports by companies, because these companies, they may exaggerate the report, or they may manipulate the earnings reports, and it's very difficult to detect. So this misbehavior or misconduct is more a deniable misconduct, so it's more difficult to identify. But a recent study by Egan and co-author have tried to estimate for the US between 205 and 215 the percentage of financial advisors that had reported cases of misconduct. And they found that 7% of financial advisors in the US have misconduct records. And in some banks, it goes even up to 15%. And so the interpretation of the authors is that there may be perhaps a matching of misconduct. So if a financial advisor has been caught for misbehavior, he may be fired by the company. But there may be other companies that may be interested even with this type of candidates. And for example, they have computed for all the banks the percentage of clients that faced advisors with misconduct record. And you can see that this is for the worst companies, if you like. For the worst, 28% or 24% of the clients have been interacting with advisors that had misconduct records. So it means that the risk is not a minor risk. Without knowing, you may give your money to people who may not be so honest. So it's very easy to find examples of fraud in many, many dimensions of the economic life. Not everywhere, of course. So for example, in politics, they never lie. Huh? But you can find examples of misbehavior everywhere. Okay, so now as economists, we have a paradigm that is extremely useful for us. It is the economics of crime approach. And this approach has been developed by Gary Becker. And you see his paper on crime and punishment has received more than 17,000 citations. We all dream of that, but for me it's too late. Okay, so what does this theory say? The success of this theory is partly explained by the fact that it delivers very simple and very elegant predictions. The first prediction is that people are rational and they just weigh the cost and the benefits of misbehaving, and if the benefit exceeds the cost, people should decide to misbehave. The second prediction is that if you increase the marginal benefit of cheating, in that case, people will be even more willing to cheat. If the risk of detection is 0, in that case, it means that the risk of being punished is 0, and so you should fully exploit your opportunities of cheating or lying or what you can imagine. And the last hypothesis is a deterrence hypothesis. So if you increase the probability of detection, or if you increase the severity of sanctions, people should be less likely to cheat, or they should cheat but less. And these two measures should be equivalent if people are risk neutral. So this is very nice, very simple predictions. And we used this model for decades. Now the problem is that most of these predictions have been challenged recently by behavioral economic studies. So basically now we can challenge each of these proposals. How do we do that? Probably you are familiar with this paradigm, the die under cup. You just ask people to roll a die in the cup. So you see there is a lid and a hole in the lid, and you shake the cup, you look at the face of the die, you are expected to report this face, and the higher the number you report, the more you earn. So it's very simple. It's clear that nobody else can observe the truth, and so if Becker is correct, everyone should report the maximum number. But it's not what has been found. Typical profile of reports is the following. So we should observe each number with 16% of chance. You see that the distribution is far from being uniform, but you see that some people report honestly. Some people report the truth, and reporting 0 or 1 when it doesn't pay anything means that these people are honest. So you have honest people, also they cannot be detected. Of course, you have people who take a chance to earn the maximum, but you also see this category of people, they cheat because it's 27% of people instead of 16. So clearly they cheat, but they don't cheat maximally. Okay, so they could make more money by reporting 5, they just stop at 4. So they don't exploit fully, although there is no risk of detection, so no risk of sanction. So it's problematic for the economics of crime approach. Now, another prediction of the theory of crime approach is if you increase incentives, the monetary incentives, people should be more willing to cheat and to lie. A meta-analysis by Abeler and co-authors has been published this year, and they take all the studies that use this paradigm of the die or coin toss. It's more than 100 studies. And they look at whether the size of the incentives for reporting the high amount affect the likelihood of cheating. And as you can see, I don't have time to develop all these cases, but you see that the profile is flat. So even if you multiply by 500 the amount you can make by cheating, the proportion of cheaters doesn't change. And so the third example I would like to show you is another recent study about civic honesty around the world. And this study has been conducted by Alain Cohn and colleagues. And what they did is that they lost wallets, pretendedly on the street, and they bring the wallet to a desk of employees at banks or police stations or post office stations, etc. And they explain, well, we have found this wallet on the street. I have to rush, I don't have time to take care of it. Would you like to take care of it? And in the wallet, it's a transparent case. There is a professional ID card. There is a grocery list, keys. And in some treatment, there is nothing else. In other treatment, there is banknotes. And in other treatment, there is even more money inside. And so they look at the proportion of people who will send this wallet back to the owner. And they ask people to make predictions. So what is the rate of return when there is no money? And what is the rate of return when there is money? And basically, this is what they find. This is just for the US, but they replicate this in the 40 other countries. The actual reporting rate increases with the amount of money that is inside the wallet. So this is exactly the opposite of what standard economists would predict. We would predict that if there is money to earn so easily, people are more likely to keep the money, especially if it's a big amount of money. And this is exactly the opposite that they find. When there is no money in the wallet, the reporting rate is about 40%. When there is $13 in the wallet, the rate goes up to almost 60%. And when there are $94 in the wallet, it goes up to 65%. So people are more honest when the amount that could be stolen increases. And they ask people to make predictions. And in fact, people predict the opposite. Non-experts predict the opposite. So the more money there is in the wallet, the lower is the returning rate. Experts predict that it shouldn't make any difference. So you see, this is an experiment that has been done in many countries with many people, and the results are extremely strong. So these three examples that I've given to you contradict completely our standard model. So in the absence of any scrutiny, not all individuals lie. So you see in the die task, all values are reported. People don't lie maximally, they just lie partially. You have about only 20% of people who maximize completely the earnings. And it has been estimated that on average in this game, people forgo about 3/4 of the money they could make by lying. Cheating does not always respond to incentives. Okay, if you increase the stakes by 500 in the die task, it doesn't change the proportion of cheaters, and the return rate of the lost wallet increases with the amount included in the wallet. So what does it tell us? Is that, well, we need to think about other models to explain unethical behavior, that's for sure. And in particular, it means that there are moral concerns that probably override the importance of the monetary incentives to misbehave. And so now in economics, people who work on dishonesty focus their effort to identify these moral concerns. So this will structure my talk. I would like to talk about three things. First, I would like to illustrate how economists today try to model the role of moral cost and beliefs when they study unethical behavior. Second, I would like to talk about which strategies individuals develop to avoid suffering this moral cost, because I started by giving you examples of dishonesty. So it's clear that there is dishonesty, there is moral cost. So how do people manage to benefit from dishonest actions without suffering from a bad reputation? So I will show you a number of strategies that people develop to use in a biased way information. And finally, if people try to avoid the moral responsibility of their misbehavior, probably we need to maintain deterrence institutions. And so the question we could ask is, if we introduce punishment against unethical behavior, does it improve the intrinsic honesty of people? So can we use deterrence institutions, detection, sanctions, to help people, to educate people to become more honest? Is it possible or not? And I would like to keep a few minutes to talk about this. Okay? But let's start with the first point. How do we study unethical decision-making? By including moral cost and moral benefit in the reasoning of people. So in economics now, you can find a number of models. I won't have time to develop all of them. I just give you some reference points. Some models consider that people have a pure lying aversion. So we have received education and we have learned that lying is bad, and we have such a high cost of lying that some people will never lie. So regardless of the opportunities you give to them, they will never lie because they have an extreme infinite lying cost. The second type of model is inspired by psychology. It's a self-concept maintenance. So people just want to keep a good image of themselves, so they may lie, but not completely, because if they lie completely, they will lose faith in their own eyes. And so they want to keep a good image, so they will not fully exploit their opportunities of cheating. So that could explain that in the die task, for example, instead of reporting the maximum number, they will report a high number, but not the highest. So that they can pretend to themselves that they are not completely dishonest, right? They cheat, but not completely. But the most recent models are different, well, related but different. They focus mainly on reputation and belief-dependent preferences. So what does it mean? It means that, in fact, if people do not react to the level of incentives, it's mainly because they don't want to look suspicious in the eyes of others. If I pretend I have got the highest number in the die task, perhaps you will not trust me, or you will have a doubt, or you will look at me saying, well, maybe this person is a liar, and I don't like this. And so these models have been developed, for example, by Duffenberg, they talk about the perceived cheating aversion. So even if you get truthfully the highest number, you may feel embarrassed reporting the highest number because you fear looking suspicious. And so you anticipate the beliefs of others about your own behavior. And you may not like this. You fear being seen as a dishonest person. So your reputational cost is proportional to the size of the supposed lie. And there is a closed models by Gnisi et al., by Abeler et al. It's very similar. In the utility function, they take into account an intrinsic cost of lying. People don't like to lie. And a reputational cost that doesn't depend on the size of the lie, but that depends on the probability of being seen as a cheater. So it's not exactly the same type of instruments, but basically it's all these papers, they try to show that the unethical behavior is very sensitive to the fact that people have a preference for honesty and the fact that they have a preference for being seen as honest people. And with these two types of dimensions, you can rationalize many of the results that have been obtained in experimental economics in the last 10 years. So I would like to illustrate this with some papers that we have conducted in Lyon. And the first example I would like to show you is a study of embezzlement and guilt aversion. So this is joint work with Giuseppe Atanasi and Claire Rimbaud. This paper uses what we call the psychological game theory. So psychological game theory tries to model guilt aversion as a belief-dependent preference. So the idea is that people don't like disappointing others. You know that other people have expectations about your actions, about your behavior, and you dislike disappointing other people. You don't want to let them down. And if this is the case, guilt-averse individuals will adjust their behavior to their beliefs about others' belief about the action. So if you believe that others expect a lot from you, you will tend to give them more. But if you expect that others don't expect so much effort from you, you will be less willing to make an effort. So you include in your reasoning your beliefs about the beliefs of others about yourself. And so we apply this model to the following situation. We study embezzlement. So embezzlement is a dishonest action by which you withhold money in the purpose of stealing this money. This money is not your own property. You have been entrusted with this money, but you keep it for yourself. So typically, you can consider the following situation. You are donating money to a charity. In fact, you would like to give the money directly to a beneficiary, but it's not so easy. If you want to help poor kids in Africa, you will not go to Africa. So you need to give your money to an intermediary. And of course, the intermediary has the possibility to transfer honestly the money, but may also keep the money for himself or herself. So the intermediary can be an NGO, can be the head of the village, can be anyone. And so the question we had is the following. Is the decision to embezzle money influenced by guilt aversion? And if we activate guilt aversion, can we increase the honesty of transfers? And the second question we had was, is guilt the same towards donors or towards recipients? Typically in the psychological game theory, you care about someone that will suffer, monetarily speaking, from your decision. So in that case, it's only the recipient, because the recipient, if you embezzle, will not get the money that was donated. In the standard psychological game theory, you shouldn't have anything special toward the donor, because if you embezzle the money, it doesn't affect the payoff of the donor, because the donor, anyway, he has given his money. So you will not reduce his payoff. But it's possible that you don't like betraying the intentions of the donor. So we don't know. So these were the two questions we had. So the intuition was the following. The donors and the recipient form beliefs about the intermediary's behavior. They have expectations about the honesty of the intermediaries. And the guilt-averse intermediaries don't want to disappoint the beliefs of the recipient or of the donors. What do we get? Before I show you the result, this is the game. Huh? So you have a donor that decides to keep the money for himself or to give the money to the beneficiary. And the intermediary has also one decision to make. He he decides to transfer honestly, or he decides to embezzle part of the donation. So it's a mini game because it's just a binary decision. I donate or I don't donate here, and as an intermediary, I transfer honestly or I embezzle a part of the money. And there is a negative externality. If the money is not transferred, less externalities is created. Less positive externality is created. So this is the basic game. It's very simple. We just need to ask the intermediary to make different decisions depending on the beliefs of the recipient or depending on the beliefs of the donors. And we will see whether they adjust their decisions based on these beliefs. So we just elicit the donors and the recipient first-order beliefs about how many intermediaries will transfer honestly the money. And we give these beliefs to the intermediaries, and the intermediaries, they have to decide whether I want to transfer the money or not if, for example, the recipient believes that 3 out of 4 intermediaries transfer, or when he believes that only 1 out of 3 intermediaries transfer, etc. So in other words, the intermediaries will make a decision for each possible belief of the donor or for each possible belief of the recipient. And if people are purely selfish, they shouldn't care. If you have a model in which people just decide selfishly, they totally ignore the belief, so they should have the same response. If people are altruistic or fully honest, again, they shouldn't care about the beliefs of others. They transfer honestly. But you may have guilt-averse people who will transfer more if the expectations of the donor or the expectations of the recipient are bigger. And this is what we get. In fact, we observe that the higher the intermediary's second-order beliefs about the transfer choice, the higher the frequency of transfer. So in other words, the higher the beliefs about the expectations of others, the more you transfer honestly. And this is what you can see on this graph. This is the light blue is a proportion of people who transfer. And here you have the intermediaries' induced second-order belief of the frequency of transfer. So if you believe that others believe that people are more honest, the proportion of honest people increases. We find that, of course, not everyone is guilt-averse, but we find that about 25% of intermediaries are guilt-averse. So it means that 75% of people, they don't care about these beliefs, but we have a group of 25% of people who really change their behavior depending on the expectations of others. So this is interesting because it may also suggest that for, if you want, in terms of policy interventions, if you want to increase the honesty or if you want to reduce embezzlement, you may try to make it clear what are the expectations of others about your actions. And we find that the guilt toward the donor and toward the recipient are the same. So the guilt affects the behavior of about a quarter of subjects, regardless of whether the decision affects the payoff of the person or not. You feel the same guilt aversion toward the donor than the recipient. Again, the donor, you don't affect his payoff. Yeah.
Maybe you've run this miracle, or if not, I'll just ask for your intuition on this. What if there's a third person who is not concerned with the transaction at all and their belief is communicated?
So just as a kind of observer, and do you care about disappointing an observer or not? My guess is that it would affect also this behavior. Perhaps we would have a lower proportion here, because perhaps just being observed by someone who is not directly affected may make these beliefs less important. But my intuition is that it would not be radically different. It is the fact that, because here we see that it's the same for donors and recipients. So it's not the fact that you take the money of someone. It is also the fact that you betray the intention of the donor. So if you have an objective third-party observer, you will not affect this person, but you know that this person will have a judgment on you, and this person probably expects something from you. So if the explanation is really in terms of second-order beliefs, my guess is that it would be almost the same.
I could see an equally valid explanation of inducing the perceived social norm by communicating these expectations.
True. So it could be indeed information about what the norm is in the group. So I think it's about the same type of mechanism. You suffer from not respecting the norm. The norm tells you what you believe that people have to do. So the norms are useful to form beliefs. So indeed, it's probably the same type of mechanism. Here you can call that guilt, of course, because it's one person, it's not a norm, it's not the society in general, but it's also related to the formation of beliefs. Okay, so we did other studies on this type of thing. So in particular, we looked at not the, so guilt aversion is intrinsic emotion, right? We tried to look at shame, so which is more observability of behavior by others who are able to judge your sentiments, so perhaps it's closer to what you had in mind. And we did that with physiological measures. So it's an old paper now, but we studied a game of tax evasion, and we give to the subject an income that they had to report, and we measured continuously the skin conductance, which is a standard measure of emotional arousal. And we look at whether people feel emotion when they report income, when they cheat, whether they feel emotions when they learn they have been audited, and whether emotions are more important when, in addition to pay a fine, because you have been caught, your picture is displayed on the screen of other players. So the other players are not affected, but it's, they just see that you are a cheater. And this is what we found. On this graph, you can see the proportion of the income that is evaded, and these bars represent the intensity of emotions as measured with the skin conductance. And you find that, well, the more people evade, the more they feel aroused when reporting their income, except for those who cheat maximally. And of course, when they learn that they have been audited, the more they have evaded and the more they react emotionally, which also makes sense because they are fined. But the purple bars are correspond to the treatment in which, in addition to the audit and fine, the picture is displayed on other subjects' screen. And you see that the difference is not large, but it is significant. So it's just a measure of shaming, the additional effect of shaming compared to simple guilt, in fact. So, of course, being exposed as a liar in front of other people increases your emotional reaction and also had an effect on income reported in the next period. So it's an additional dimension that influences behavior of people. Okay, so this was just a few examples about the role of emotions and beliefs in the decision to misbehave. Now, again, at the beginning of the talk, I told you that there are many examples of dishonest behavior. So how is that possible that we see a lot of dishonesty? At the same time, people seem to be reluctant to lie when there is no scrutiny. How can we reconcile this? And so we are now working more and more about the identification of avoidance strategies. So to avoid the moral cost of misbehavior. And basically we work on three categories of strategies. The first type of strategy is motivated beliefs and search for uncertainty. You create uncertainty to avoid suffering the moral cost of misbehavior. The second type of strategies is related to moral disengagement and self-justification. You find excuse to misbehave. And the third strategy is using narratives and moral persuasion. So let me be more precise on each type of category, and then I will give illustrations. So the first example, the first category is motivated beliefs. So in economics, we use three terms. So we talk about motivated beliefs, as in models by Roland Benabou. We talk about motivated Bayesian individuals, so it's papers from psychology that we also use for our work. Or we also talk about motivated cognitive limitations. If people have cognitive limitations, it may not be only because they are limited, it may be because they create limitations. So let me give you some examples. We can use risk, we can use ambiguity as a good excuse to behave unethically. So for example, you are selfish, but if charity asks you for money, you feel embarrassed not giving, so you give. But if you have a chance to avoid the person who asks for money, you will change the street, or you will develop this type of strategy. Or you will take as an excuse the fact that you never know whether there is embezzlement. So perhaps I will give money to this charity, but the money will not arrive to the final beneficiary. So this is risky or ambiguous. So I prefer not to donate because it is risky. And so we can observe these type of strategies using risk, uncertainty, as an excuse to misbehave. Ethical blind spots, you don't see information. Information avoidance, it's one step further. It's not that you do not see the information, you actively avoid information. And so this is willful ignorance to create some moral wiggle room to avoid having to behave in a nice way because you are fundamentally selfish. Another strategy, and I will illustrate this in a minute, it's you cannot avoid information, but you can retrieve this information in a biased way. So in other words, you can use selective memory. You forget. Oh yes, you promised to give money, there was a pledge and you promised to give money to reconstruct the cathedral, and oh, you forgot. You forgot. And the last strategy is to process information in a biased way. So, okay, so you don't see information, there is no information, you avoid information, you forget information, or you process it in a biased way. These are a list of strategies. The second category of moral strategy is, we know that from psychology, the moral balancing and moral accounting. You have been good, so now you can misbehave. Or you have misbehaved, so now it would be better to do a good action. So you try to balance your morality. You can try to justify your actions by making reference to social norms. So you use social norms as a good excuse to misbehave. And if I have time, I will show you an example that we have developed here. We study homophily. So the idea that if you want to misbehave, you will just choose a group of friends who are people who misbehave. And so the norm is the norm of people who misbehave. And you don't suffer from a moral cost. Another group of strategy is delegating decision to someone else so that it is the other person who will bear the responsibility. So you don't do it yourself, you give some power to other people, you anticipate that these people will behave selfishly, and if there is a social blame, it is the other person who will suffer from the blame, not you. And the last group of strategies is responsibility sharing. You just try to find an excuse not to do something. So this includes, for example, the bystander effect. Someone is harassed in the metro, but there are many other passengers, so why should you intervene yourself? There are other people who can do it. And so this is also a way to share responsibility and perhaps not to misbehave, but at least not to suffer from good behavior. And the third category is the use of narratives and moral persuasion. This is much more recent in economics, and there are not many papers yet on this topic. But the idea is that these strategies can change the beliefs of people based not on what people do or decide, but based on what people say. So this includes many things. So Benabou, Falk, and Tirole define a narrative as any news, story, life experience, or heuristic that has a potential to alter an agent's beliefs about the trade-off between private benefit and social cost. So you may downplay the negative externalities of your misbehavior. So you tell story, it's storytelling. Huh? This storytelling may be used for different things. You may just downplay the negative externalities of your actions. Think of environment and protecting the environment. It's good if your neighbor is doing it, but it's more complicated for you to change your way of living. And so you will tend to find excuse to downplay the negative externalities of your selfish actions. I still use my car because my car is polluting less than the average car. Narrative. Or it may be simply exaggerating the cost of moral behavior. Of course, I would be happy to help to reduce the poverty of poor kids in Africa. But what can I do at my level? I cannot do anything. Or it may be suggesting that you are not pivotal in a group decision. You make a decision in a group, but it's not your own decision that will change the outcome. It is everyone who has to make something, but me, no, it doesn't depend on me, the outcome. So I can be selfish because it will not make a difference. So you see all these type of strategies. Now we try to identify them in the lab. So let me give you some illustrations. The first one, I would like to show you some recent experiment that we did on selective memory. Then I will talk about the market for ignorance, and if I have time, about homophily. So selective memory. We are able to forget many things. And for many reasons, I think that I have two daughters. Probably I wouldn't have had a second daughter if I didn't forget how painful it was for the first one. So it helps us, probably it helps all humans to survive, right? So the idea is that selective memory can help you to create a moral wiggle room, to downplay the negative externalities of your decisions. And in Benabou and Tirole model, it's defined as a differential rate of recall or awareness in response to desirable or undesirable information. So it includes two things. It may be selective recalls, so you will remember or forget positive or negative events. Or it may be biased recalls. You will tend to exaggerate the positive memories and you tend to undermine the negative memories. And the size will be possible to manipulate. So we studied that in dictator games with Charlotte Sausset. And so the idea was to study whether individuals exhibit selective memory after behaving selfishly. And so to study this, we used dictator games. So the game was very, very simple. People had to make simply choices between two options, X and Y. And across games, we varied the inequality between the two players, the passive player and the dictator. And we varied also whether the dictator was in a disadvantageous position or advantageous position, or whether there was a switch. So the dictators make 12 decisions in random order. Then they play other tasks. And then we ask them to recall what they did, or the consequences of what they did. So we tell them for each of the 12 decisions they made, in this game you add this option and this option. You have selected option Y. So option X was 5 for you, 35 for the other player. You have chosen option Y, giving 7 to you, and something to the other player. So tell us what is the amount that you gave to the other person. And they have to recall that for the 12 decisions. And we manipulated a certain number of things. We manipulated whether we incentivize or not the recalls. So in some treatments, people were not paid based on the accuracy. In other treatment, they were paid if they reported more accurate memories. We manipulated also the responsibility of the dictator. So in some treatment, the dictator made the decisions, and in other treatment, the dictator was just observing the decision of the program, of the computer program. And the computer program simply implemented decisions made by the other players in the past sessions. So manipulation of incentives and of the responsibility. What did we get? We find a lot of evidence of selective recalls in the sense that when people make an altruistic decision, so they choose the option that is generous to the other passive player, they recall much better what they did, the amount given to the other, than when they made selfish options, selfish decisions. So when you make a selfish decision, well, you forget. When you made a nice decision to the other person, perhaps it was more costly to you, huh? It was more costly to you, and you remember much better. But this difference, yeah?
Can I just ask, is this willingly you forget, or you...
That we don't know. It would be good to do that in the scanner and to see which area network activates to be able to say more. That we don't know. But the only response I can give to you is that we have a treatment in which we pay people to remember accurately. So this helps us to address your question. In fact, we observe that when you pay people, they remember better. So it means that they have encoded, probably. They have encoded, but they put more or less effort to remember. But I cannot say more because we were not observing the brain of the people. But the two main results was that indeed people remember better the altruistic decision they made, but this was true only when they were active. So when they really did themselves this decision. But when it was a computer that made the decision, there was no difference. So it's really related to the fact that these people, they willingly gave more to the other participant, and they remember that better. And it was the case when they were incentivized to recall. So accuracy is better when you incentivize because people invest this additional effort in the retrieval of positive image of themselves. And we found no evidence of biased memory. So it was not the case that when they forgot, they do not exaggerate the amount they gave to the other person. So no, we don't see evidence of this. Okay. Coming back to dishonesty, we are now studying motivated memory in lying behavior. So do people forget that they lied to the experimenter or not? So do they exhibit motivated memory after lying? And is there more amnesia when forgetting is instrumental or when it's only hedonic? So the difference here, we try to separate the two. The hedonic value of forgetting is that you forget your misbehavior because you want to keep a good image of yourself. The instrumental value is that you will recall selectively in the anticipation of future decisions that you will have to make. So to some extent, you anticipate you will have to make a decision that will be more difficult to make if you don't forget. So in that case, it is instrumental and not only hedonic. It's not only affective. So how did we do that? We did an experiment on Mechanical Turk with 1,300 people. And they had to participate in 2 sessions separated by 3 weeks. And in the first session, they just had to play 20 rounds of a mind-wheel game. What is it? On their screen, they see a wheel with 6 boxes. The first screen is completely empty. The boxes are empty. We just ask them, choose in your head, don't tell us, but choose in your head one of the boxes. And once it is done, you click a button, and then we will display the numbers in the wheel. So, for example, if you have chosen this box, now you learn that it is 6. It's great because 6 pays more. So it's fantastic. But imagine you had selected this one in your head. Well, I should report 2, if I am honest. But it's tempting to report more. After all, the 6 was next to 2, to this one. It's in your decision. We cannot observe that. We just observe what people report to have seen in the box they had chosen in their head. So it's clear that it's a mind game because we cannot observe the truth. But they made the decision 20 times. So we can identify by looking at the distribution of what they reported, whether they are liars or not. So it's an indirect evidence of cheating. So this is a game. 3 weeks later, they come back. They connect on Mturk. And we tell them at the very beginning, you know, you may have the possibility to reduce your earnings by 75 cents. And it would be nice to reduce your earnings if you are given this option to reduce, and if you have misreported numbers to your advantage several times in the first session. It's just a moral signal. Huh? Nobody will force you to do it, but it would be nice to do it if you have cheated several times, basically. So they learn, everyone learns, observe this, and then they are allocated randomly to one of the 2 conditions. The instrumental condition, they will be given this option. They know that at the end of the second session, they will have this opportunity to give money back. In the hedonic condition, they know that they will not have this opportunity. So they receive the same moral signal, but they have no instrumental reason to not recall what they did, because they will not be asked whether they want to give money back. And we ask them to recall the distribution of the numbers they reported in session 1. So we tell them how many ones did you report, how many 2 did you report, etc. And the total must be equal to 20. They are incentivized, so they earn money if their their recalls are accurate. And then, for those who are in the instrumental condition, they have the opportunity to return money. Okay? This is what we have also control conditions in which people cannot cheat. Because, of course, it's easier to recall a uniform distribution than to recall a non-uniform distribution. So we need to control for the actual memory of people when they had no possibility to cheat, or when there are no reason to manipulate their memory. This is what we observe. So here, this is the distribution, this is the size of memory error when people are classified as honest. So when the distribution of the reported numbers in the first session is not significantly different from the uniform. So basically, perhaps they lied sometimes, but overall, they cannot be classified as liars. So this is the average error. So you see they don't make many mistakes. In the instrumental, in the hedonic treatment, no difference. This is a control in which people couldn't lie, couldn't cheat. They forget a bit more, because probably they paid less attention to the task. But nothing is significantly different. This is for the honest people. Now I will show you the result for the dishonest people, those we classify as dishonest, because on average the reported numbers deviate significantly from the uniform distribution. This is what we have. So this is a control where people couldn't cheat. So indeed, you see that those people who received also a non-uniform distribution to recall, they make more mistakes, because it's more difficult to remember. No difference with the hedonic treatment, and a significant difference and large difference with the instrumental treatment. Meaning what? Meaning that those people who learn that at the end of the session they will be proposed to give money back, they forget more compared to those who learn that they will not have this opportunity. So these guys, they also receive the moral appeal, but not the possibility to give money back in the future. And so the result we interpret it as hedonic motives, affective motives perhaps are not sufficient, to generate selective memory, but having an instrumental reason to forget because you know that it may affect your future decision creates enough power to change the behavior of people. And here, when you say it's not significant, it's a very conservative test because it's likely that these people who couldn't cheat, they paid less attention. So probably they make mistakes by loss of attention. So it's possible that if we were able to force them to pay the same attention as people who could lie, it could have been lower. So it could have been significantly different. Well, this is not what we have so far. So hedonic considerations are not sufficient to trigger memory manipulation. And when forgetting serves as a justification to keep undeserved money, subjects engage in motivated memory. Completely different strategy to avoid the moral cost of your behavior is trying to find ignorance. We have a lot of papers in psychology and economics showing that people indeed demand ignorance when they have the possibility to make pro-social decisions. Because it's easy. If you can avoid inconvenient information, it's easy for you to be selfish. And so the question we had is that we already know that there is a demand for ignorance, but is there also a supply of ignorance by advisors? We always think of advisors as people who have private information, and they inform you more or less honestly. But if there is a demand for ignorance among individuals, it may be that some advisors are willing to provide ignorance. So imagine a company is forced to ask for a certificate because it plans to do an investment that may have negative consequences for the environment, so it needs a certification. Perhaps this company may be willing to find advisors that are more lenient. So perhaps also there is a market for these advisors to provide more uncertain information. So this is what we wanted to test here. And we wanted to see whether those people who demand for ignorance are able to meet a supply of ignorance. So this is how we did that. So we did this study with Charles Chalvy, Ivan Sarapera, and Joël van der Velde. And this is the situation. You have a decision maker, you have advisors, and you have the experimenter, and the experimenter will give a donation, will make a donation to a charity in Africa. A 15 euro donation. But there are two cases. There are two options. The decision maker will have to choose between option 1 and option 2. With option 1, he earns 9 euro. With option 2, he earns 15 euro. So of course, everyone prefers option 2 to option 1. But there are two possible situations with a 50% chance for each. In the good state of nature, it is option 1 that cancels the donation of the experimenter to the charity. So if the decision maker chooses option 1, he will get only 9 for himself, and he will cancel the donation to the charity. But it's a good situation because, of course, the decision maker prefers option 2. He will make 15 for himself, and it will let the experimenter give the money to the charity. So this is a good state of nature. Now, the bad state of nature, it is the opposite. It is option 2 that cancels the donation to the charity. So now you have a moral dilemma, because you still prefer, as a decision maker, to choose option 2 that gives you 15 instead of 9. But you know that if you choose option 2, you will cancel the donation to the charity. So you have good state of nature, bad state of nature. The decision makers are not aware of which option cancels the donation, but they can receive information from advisors. So advisors are other subjects, and the advisors are informed on which option cancels the donation 80% of the time. So in 20% of the time, they don't receive any news, but in 80% of the time, they know which option cancels. And they can send the message to the decision maker saying it is option 1 or option 2. Or they can send a message saying, I don't know. So if the advisor is informed and decides to reveal information, In that case, the decision maker will receive the picture of the beneficiary. The charity we chose is Give Directly. This is a charity that sends money directly on the mobile phone to people in Africa. So when you visit their website, you can see a list of projects. You can see a lot of people who ask for money, and they explain, there is a sentence here, they explain for which purpose they would like to receive money. And you can choose. So this is what we use. We use these pictures from potential beneficiaries. And so if the advisor sends information to the decision maker knows the picture of the beneficiary, and he learns which option cancels the donation. So if it is option 2 that cancels the donation, he has a moral dilemma. He is informed that if he chooses option 2, these guys will not get the money. But the advisor can also decide not to send any information. Pretend he doesn't know. Pretend that he was in these 20% of cases where he was not informed himself. In that case, he can send another picture. And we use pictures of cute animals. You say, this picture that you can find on Twitter, on Facebook, people exchange a lot of these animal pictures. They are very cute, huh? And so the decision maker receives either full information or just an informative animal picture. And then he chooses option 1 or option 2. We want to know the type of the advisors. So in the first part, before we introduce the notion of advisor, we ask everyone to make a decision between option 1 and option 2 when everybody knows that it is option 2 that cancels the donation. We want to see whether people are selfish or not. Do they care about canceling the donation or not? Then they make a second decision under uncertainty. Now they don't know which option cancels, but they can press a button, reveal. So we know whether people prefer to be informed or not. And only after that, we create this market with decision makers and advisors. And basically, we have 3 conditions. Exo means that we match exogenously advisors and decision makers. Endo means that each decision maker is able to choose one advisor among the 3. And the decision maker makes his choice based on the report of each advisor in the previous period. So basically, they know how many times each advisor sent information, bad news, good news, or no news. So he knows the type of the advisor. So, results. If people reveal honestly the truth, we should see good news and bad news 40% of the time, and no news 20% of the time. This is the case if if advisors reveal honestly the information they got. This is what we found. In fact, the most consumed information is no news. We don't know which option cancels. In fact, it is the same for the 2 treatments. In 40% of the time, the news that is sent is, I don't know. I did not receive any information. I send you these cute animal pictures. So this is 40% instead of 20. So a lot of ignorance is sent in these markets. The demand of ignorance is relatively important also. The majority of people want to know. So here we just look at the choice of advisors, choosing the advisor that almost never suppress information, choosing advisor that suppress a lot of information, an intermediate case. You see that if you look at the aggregate data, people prefer on average having informative advisors. But if you decompose this data, I don't have time to develop that in details, but just look at the 2 extreme conditions here. Here I classify people based on the decision they made before we introduce the market. And on the left, you have the people who, when there was an uncertainty, click the reveal button. They wanted to know which option cancels. Here it is a case of the people who avoided information. They chose option without revealing. And you see the profile of these guys is completely different. Those people who were willing to know and who made altruistic decisions, they want to choose advisors that never suppress information. And on the opposite, the people who avoided information before the market opened and who made selfish decisions, they choose advisors that provide a lot of cute animal pictures. So depending on your type, depending on your willingness to know or not to know, depending on your altruistic versus selfish type, you will select advisors that provide information or provide ignorance. And we have a lot of ignorance. We have 70% of advisors that suppress information, and 25% of people suppress more than half of the bad news. So they know that by suppressing this information, the decision maker will make a selfish decision. So they know that for sure it will lead to no donation. So that's a lot of suppression, especially, again, it depends on the type of the advisors. Those advisors who don't want to be informed and who are selfish, they are more likely to provide ignorance to others. Assortative matching, indeed, we find that the market, so people can change advisors over time, over the repetition of the game, and we see clearly that people, decision makers who like ignorance and behave selfishly, they are able to select advisors who don't provide information. So the market is pretty effective. People match according to their type. It works very well. People who want to be informed, they select advisors that provide information. I will skip this because I don't have time, I think, if we want to exchange ideas. And I will briefly talk about the last third aspect. We know that people develop a lot of strategies to behave selfishly, dishonestly, without suffering the moral cost of it. But at the same time, we see a lot of dishonest behavior, and typically we implement institutions to detect and to punish violators. So typically we use the police, we use fines. We can both use fines and moral disapproval. This is a campaign of publicity in the public transport in Lyon. So they really try to show that, well, you may lose a lot of money if you are caught, and plus your morality is really threatened. Huh? Okay, so we have a lot of studies looking at the impact of these institutions, and indeed they are relatively effective because they can change incentives. But what we don't know is whether the enforcement of these institutions make people change their nature. When you are punished, when you are fined, do you learn that it's bad behavior, and do you learn to become more honest or less selfish, etc.? So is there any educative effect of these institutions? So what is the effect on intrinsic honesty? Is it positive, so there is an educative effect? Is it negative, a crowding out effect? Is it the same for honest and for dishonest people? It's difficult to study because, of course, in real life, the institutions is always there. So you cannot see whether when you have been punished in public transport because you were fined, whether you will change your behavior, because the institution is still there tomorrow. So I still know that there will be, again, control, perhaps. So we thought about the following experiment. This is something that we did with Fabio Galeotti and Valeria Magian. We did a field experiment in public transport in Lyon and on the street. And why public transport? Because in Lyon, it's a fantastic place to observe dishonesty, everyday type of dishonesty. Huh? Because you have to validate your ticket or your pass each time you get on board. And you cannot buy the ticket on board, huh? So you cannot pretend you were not able to buy it before. You have to validate. So the ticket is valid for an hour. You can switch from the metro to the tram to the bus, it's no problem. But each time you get on board of a new vehicle, you have to validate your ticket or your pass. So someone who doesn't validate on the machine is in irregular situation, and if inspected, will have to pay a fine. Okay? So it's a nice situation for us to observe simple dishonesty. So we did this experiment with 700 passengers. And this is a two-step experiment. The first stage, we wanted to measure fraud in the natural setting. So we have an experimenter and an actor. The actor is passive on the bus, doesn't do anything. And the role of the experimenter is to look at the first 4 or 5 passengers who get on board. Just remember, take note of whether this person validated or not. The first of these passengers who exit the bus is a target of the experiment. So there is some randomness. It's just the first of these guys getting out that becomes the subject of the experiment. So we have a natural 2x2 context. We have passengers with a validated ticket or pass and passengers without a validated ticket. And of course, sometimes there is a ticket inspection. So it's natural setting. We just observe that in some cases, there are ticket inspectors that get on board and inspect everyone. So we have 4 categories of people: fraudsters, non-fraudsters, fraudsters inspected or not inspected, non-fraudsters inspected or not inspected. We have these 4 categories of people. This is the first stage. What is the second stage? I told you we followed the one targeted passenger when getting off the bus or the tram. So we followed the person on the street. We wait that there are not many people left around. And then it is now the actor that has to do something. And the actor, he walks behind the passenger and suddenly he bends down and he seemingly picks up a banknote of €5. And he called the attention of the passenger saying, "Oh, monsieur, madame, have you lost this?" And that's it. The passenger takes the banknote or doesn't take it. This is our measure of intrinsic honesty. So, this is just a reconstitution. I don't know how. Yes. So it's a reconstitution. This is Fabio, that is the passenger. The actor is just behind. You see, the scene is very quick. This is, okay, the passenger, the actor just behind. The actress is on the phone. All the scenes were played with the phone because we recorded the actor. Because we asked subject in the lab afterwards to predict whether the passenger took the banknote or not. We wanted to make sure that the actor played the scene similarly in all conditions. So this is a scene. This is what we get, the result. We want two situations that are correlated. We want a situation in which there is a deterrence institution, public transport, and we want a situation in which we expect that dishonest people in public transport can be dishonest on the street, but without the deterrence institution. Of course, it's not illegal to accept a banknote from someone else. It breaks a social norm, we tested for that, but it's not illegal. So indeed, this is what we find. This is a proportion of people who take the banknote among the fraudsters in the bus. So 50% of the fraudsters took the banknote, and it's only the case of 30% of the non-fraudsters in public transport. So it's okay, the difference is significant, so it shows that indeed fraudsters in public transport are more likely to violate a social norm on the street. Then we want to see whether ticket inspections have an impact on the acceptance rate of the banknote on the street. So if you have been audited in the bus, you had not validated your ticket, you have been fined, so what are you doing afterwards? Is there an educative effect? So I mean, I'm more likely not to take the banknote because I know that if I misbehave, I may be punished. Or is it something else? So what are your expectations? So this is a basic rate. Fraudsters, 50% of them, when they are not inspected, take the banknote. So what's your feeling after the ticket inspection? Who thinks that the rate will increase? Yeah. Who think that the rate of acceptance will decrease? The education effect. And many people don't know. Okay, so this is what we observe. Yeah, sure.
The people that you observe afterwards, after this control, did these people already pay a fine, or they were just observer in the train while somebody was controlling?
No, because they always inspect everyone. So these people are really people who have been fined. Perhaps they didn't pay immediately, that we control for that, but they have to pay a fine. So these guys, so no educative effect of deterrence institutions. So the fact that you are caught cheating doesn't make you more honest a few minutes afterwards. People are more willing to cheat on the street. It may be for different reasons. They have been fined, so they may be willing to recover a loss. It may be a reminder of your nature. After all, you have been exposed as a cheater. Now who cares? You are a cheater, you're a cheater. It may be moral cleansing. You have paid a fine, so you have redeemed your sin. Now you are clean, so you can start again. It may be anger. So there are many reasons that we try to control for afterwards, but at this stage we cannot say much. Now, what is the impact on the non-fraudsters? So this is the initial rate, 30%. So what are your expectations on fraudsters? So the non-fraudsters, they have seen an inspection, and but they have been inspected, but nothing happened because they were in a regular situation. So who expect that the rate will increase? Who expect that the rate will decrease? This is what we get. So we find the same, and the magnitude is the same. We did a difference analysis, magnitude is the same. After a ticket inspection, regardless of whether you are personally and monetarily affected or not, you are more likely to violate the norm on the street. So in other words, here it means that for the honest or the non-fraudsters, it cannot be explained by a loss recovery. They have not been fined, so they have no money to recover, no loss to recover. So this was a surprising effect, so that we try to, oh yes, another result is that the bigger the team of inspectors, the higher the effect on the acceptance rate of the banknote on the street. So if they have, these crackdowns, they lock all the doors and they inspect everyone with a team of 10 people. We had even up to 20. It goes up linearly with the size of the ticket inspection. So explanation, we can rule out a number of explanations. It cannot be driven by a direct negative reciprocity against the authority, because on the street, if you accept or not the banknote, it will not affect the transport company. It cannot be explained by loss recovery for the non-fraudsters. Emotions, so we have some measures of emotions, doesn't seem to predict anything. The change in norms, we did some additional surveys, because it could be that if there are many ticket inspectors, it means that there are probably many fraudsters. So it means that the moral norm in the society is weak. So if you learn that there are many cheaters around you, after all, why should you be honest yourself? So we try to measure injunctive norms, descriptive norms, after or without ticket inspections. We don't find any difference. So it doesn't be the explanation. So we cannot isolate precisely the explanation, but we are left with two candidates. Could be moral balancing. For the non-fraudster, they have been honest, and so now they can misbehave. For the dishonest people, they have paid a fine, so now they can cheat again. That's possible. Our favorite explanation, though, is more that of Benabou and Tirole. The ticket inspection signals what your true nature is, so that it crowds out your intrinsic honesty when there are ticket inspections. Because you know that in the framework of public transport, there are ticket inspections. So if you have a ticket yourself or a pass, it's not because you are fundamentally honest, it's because you know that you will be punished if you are caught. And so it's possible that by contrast, when you are on the street, it's not illegal to accept money. And second, there's no inspectors checking at you to punish you if you don't. So the contrast between the two cases, I am honest in cases where there may be a risk, but I may be dishonest when there is no risk. So it may be a kind of balancing effect that is more due to a signaling nature of the deterrence institutions. Okay, so let me conclude because it's time. So clearly, as economists, we have to confess that indeed we need to understand ethical behavior. We need to go beyond our traditional standard economics of crime approach. It's not sufficient to account for moral costs, monetary costs, incentives. We have to understand belief-dependent preferences, norms, and motivated beliefs. So this suggests that we should spend more time probably to investigate these moral strategies that people imagine, develop to behave selfishly while keeping a good image of themselves. And we need to understand better these processes of motivated cognitive limitations. More research is needed on the link between deterrence institutions and moral strategies. There are almost nothing relating the two. How people learn norms. It seems obvious to us that you learn norms by your parent, by looking at what other people do, but we don't know precisely how people learn norms. And we should also investigate which type of intervention should we develop as policymakers. Should we emphasize more the negative externalities of bad behavior, or should we emphasize more the positive externalities of good behavior? Is it symmetric? Is it equivalent or not? We don't know. So let me finish by thanking a number of people, the people I'm working on, and I cited a number of papers with these guys. My colleagues at GateLab, a research program that fund me. And this morning I had the chance, thanks to my dear colleagues, to visit Brno. And I've seen this tree with the two chairs at the castle. And don't ask me to read what is written here. I hope you can read it. But I thought it was a nice conclusion for this talk. So thank you very much.